No lies, no distortions, just the facts and the truth about issues that matter. Facts First with Christian Esqueda.
Good evening, guys. Welcome to tonight's episode of Facts First. I'm your host, Christian Esguera. Tonight, our topic is very important because this week, Filipinos are going to mark 50 years since former President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. placed the entire country under martial law. That's 50 years ago this week. So, we're going to talk about this. But before that, I'd like to greet some of our avid viewers, in particular, Mr. Isagani Jose. He messaged me on Facebook asking for a shout out. So I'd like to greet you and thank you very much for your continued support. And also, I'd like to greet a very good friend of mine, Mr. Abel Pineda. A very happy birthday. So, um, ingat ka lagi. Okay, Abel. So, you might be wondering why I'm speaking in straight English now because our guest is a very special one. He is a veteran journalist who covered the Philippines for so long, in particular, the Marcos regime, and of course, the EDSA People Power Revolution, that pivotal moment in Philippine history in 1986. So, we're going to talk about this in the context of the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law, and of course, 36 years after the fall of the Marcoses in 1986. Another Marcos, the son of the late dictator, is now the president of the Philippines. How is that? Okay, I'd like to introduce to you our very special guest. He's a veteran journalist, Mr. Louis Simons. Okay, he is the author of the book Worth Dying For, and his newspaper series about the Marcos hidden wealth in 1986 won the Pulitzer Prize, and he has an upcoming book about his life as a foreign correspondent, To Tell the Truth, which will be out on November 15 this year. Good evening here in Manila, and good morning there in Washington. Sir, thank you for joining us tonight on Facts First.
Thank you, Christian. Good evening to you,
Okay, how are you doing, sir?
as well as one can do at this advanced stage.
Okay, before we talk about the main issue tonight, let's talk about your career as a foreign correspondent. How many years did you work as a foreign correspondent, and how much of this career was spent covering the Philippines?
I began in 1967 covering the war in Vietnam for the Associated Press, and continued essentially for the next 50 years to work and travel and live pretty much in most, if not every country in Asia. And I began covering the Philippines while I was based in Kuala Lumpur in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when Ferdinand Marcos was in his first term of power. I became much more involved in the Philippines with the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. And from then on, through the People Power Uprising and the expulsion of the Marcos regime, I was, although based in Tokyo at that point for the Knight Ridder chain and in particular the San Jose Mercury News in California, I was based in Tokyo, but nevertheless, I spent much more time in the Philippines than in Japan or anywhere else. It was for me a pivotal story that changed the Philippines forever and had an enormous impact around the world.
Of course, that was also the height of the Cold War and the height of the communist insurgency in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. But in terms of, by way of comparison, what was the Philippines like at that time, and how different was the context of the Philippines compared to the rest of Southeast Asia that you were also covering?
Yeah, well, it was in other parts of the region, things were beginning to move. As I said to you, I was based in Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia was just beginning to move. It was not directly affected by the war in Vietnam, and so the economy was beginning to move ahead. Singapore, where I also had responsibility for AP, was really beginning to take off under Lee Kuan Yew, and I call Lee Kuan Yew my favorite dictator. He was he was one of the few, I think, who managed to combine his dictatorial instincts with an honest and clean record, and benefited his people. Uh, I really have to say that the Philippines was lagging behind, uh, and this was not for me, leaving me out of it completely, but uh, for uh, for Americans in general. This was disappointing. The Philippines, of course, was terribly damaged by the war, World War II,
Mm.
and it was expected that with U.S. assistance and all its natural resources and the natural gifts of its people, English language, all the rest of it, that the Philippines was going to do extremely well and would probably lead Southeast Asia. But instead, it was becoming the sick man of Asia, and a name that has stuck far too long. So it was, I say, disappointing in that sense. However, I have to mention that for me personally, as a journalist and as just as a human being, uh, the people I met, the Filipinos I met, were wonderful, and
Mm.
and although I'd been trained as a journalist to keep myself apart from the stories and the people I covered. I couldn't really help myself, and to this day, I have a very warm place in my heart for Filipinos.
Okay. There's an interesting point that you mentioned earlier that Lee Kuan Yew was your favorite dictator.
Mm,
How about Ferdinand Marcos?
not, not so much. Look, this is these were two very different people. Certainly they overlapped in their sense of themselves, their senses of self-importance. They certainly overlapped, but frankly, in from my observation, and I only had a one-on-one interview with Ferdinand Marcos once. I interviewed Lee Kuan Yew and met him half a dozen times over the years.
Mm.
I certainly have a better sense of him, but he was a brilliant man, and he used his intellectual prowess to improve the lives of his people. Now, I have to say that in the very earliest days, toward the end of the Vietnam War and the first few years of post war development, what Lee had in mind for Singapore and for Singaporeans was not necessarily welcomed by them. There were lots of Singaporeans, particularly the intelligentsia, the English educated, the westernized Singaporeans, who did not welcome Lee's a sense of what he wanted to do with them and their country. And people would complain all the time about it. But it's hard to say, particularly when one is talking about another country, not one's own country, not one's own self. But
Mm.
I think in the case of Singapore, father knew best, and I think the results speak for themselves. Is Singapore completely free today? No, it is not. The press is controlled, uh,
Mm.
and there are regulations that boggle the mind. Nevertheless, the standard of living is one of the best in the world, not just in
Mm.
Southeast Asia. This did not happen in the Philippines. Marcos, he may have been Lee's equal intellectually. I don't know, but he served himself first. He served his family first, and that is something that Lee Kuan Yew did not do.
Mm.
That's I think the heart of the difference.
Okay, but of course, to be fair to Marcos and the Philippines, we're also talking here of two different contexts. I mean, the Philippines and Singapore. The Philippines being an archipelago, the Singapore being a small city state. So these can also be factors in terms of how one did not develop as fast as the other, perhaps. Of course, the population was quite different also. You mentioned that you had a one-on-one interview with Ferdinand Marcos. When was this and how was it?
That would have been 1969. I was the AP bureau chief for Malaysia and Singapore, and I came to the Philippines specifically to interview the president. AP did have a bureau in Manila and a full time correspondent, but for I guess because of personal reasons, I really can't recall. It's been a very long time, but I was asked to go over to Manila and interview him. Um, One thing that stuck with me is he we were in his office, and I walked in. My wife was with me. We walked in, and the room was empty. He was not there, and then he came in from a side door to the right side of this very large, I guess it was teak desk.
Mm-mm.
And as he walked in, I could see that he was considerably shorter than I. I'm not a tall person. I'm 5'9", but I guessed he was around 5'6".
Mm-mm.
And and then suddenly he was towering over me, and then I realized that he had stepped up onto a platform, and his desk was on a platform. So for the entire period of the interview, he was looking down at me. I think it was a clever little psychological trick that he played on people who came to see him. He seemed to be sensitive about his height. He was a good-looking man.
Yeah.
Uh, he was fit. You,
Mm.
you could see that he was wearing a barang Tagalog, and you could see that he was very muscular. He was bright. He was ill at ease being interviewed. I have to say, to flash back on Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew uh, was never happy being interviewed by foreign correspondents because he couldn't really control them. So he was unpleasant. Marcos was not particularly unpleasant, but he was ill at ease. He was uncomfortable. To be perfectly honest, I can't remember uh, the details of the interview. Suffice to say that it was not particularly revealing of anything. He didn't want to get too deeply into uh, his affairs, his plans. He was articulate. He spoke very well, but limited himself as to the scope of what he wanted to discuss.
Mm. That was toward the end of his first term. But at that time, did you also have an inkling that martial law might be on the table for him, or that
I
he
did
might be doing something quite drastic in the coming
I
years?
to be honest, I did not have that kind of foresight. I suppose if one had been steeped in Southeast Asian politics at that point, and I was not, one might have foreseen something about to happen. But I was 26, 27 years old. I was a
Mm.
kid. I had my experience at that point was 1 year of covering combat in Vietnam, a few months of covering Malaysia, where not much was happening. It was at peace with itself and its neighbors. So coming down to Manila and interviewing the president didn't really. I was not really in a position to make that kind of judgment.
Okay. But for your book, Worth Dying For, which came out when? 87, right? 1987?
Yes.
Okay. Much of the reporting happened between the time Ninoy Aquino was assassinated in 83 and the fall of the Marcoses during the Edsa People Power Revolution in 1986. That's when I understand you spent most of your time covering the Philippines,
Yes,
right?
that's
Okay.
right.
Oh, how was the situation then, and how were foreign correspondents like you treated at that time, especially during when the Philippines was still very much under martial law technically because that was lifted in 81.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe, excuse me, maybe I ought to give you a little sort of set the scene for you as to how I became involved. At that point, I had already moved on from AP to the Washington Post, and I was their correspondent in India and Southeast Asia for quite some time. I was far more experienced than I had been when I first came to Manila and interviewed Ferdinand Marcos. And my wife and I and our two little girls at that time we were in San Jose in
Mhm.
California on our way to the East Coast where our families lived. Stopped off to see my editors, and I was in my editor's office when the AP printer started clanging frantically, and a bulletin came across saying Ninoy Aquino had been assassinated in Manila at the airport. And I said to the editor, "I'm leaving now. I'm going to Manila." I deserted my wife and kids right there and took off. Now, it was clear to me by then. I was much more experienced and understood that this was big news. This was a huge story, and by the time whatever it was, 18 hours or so, 16 hours that it took for me to fly from San Francisco to Manila, the rumors were wild all over Manila that this had been a set up by the government, that Marcos had to be involved, that General Ver had to be involved, and the place was just swarming with correspondents, everybody looking for the same story. So this is kind of uh, a maybe an advanced class in journalism, but uh,
Go ahead, sir. We appreciate that.
uh, there I was having to cover a major breaking story, a story that was just spinning out of control, not day by day, but hour by hour. And at the same time, uh, I I began hearing from Filipinos, some of whom I knew for years, some of whom I was meeting for the first time, people in influential positions. I began hearing stories of dollar salting, hidden
Mm,
wealth, investments by the Marcoses and their cronies in the United States, in Europe, in the Caribbean, in Australia. And this was, I knew that there were other journalists over the years, both Filipinos and foreigners, who had attempted to penetrate that story, but nobody had done it with any success. Nobody had been
mhm.
able to. So while I'm covering the breaking news, I'm beginning to collect information of the kind I just told you about.
Yeah.
And after, I don't know, 6 months perhaps, I had a lot of material, specific buildings that Imelda Marcos had purchased allegedly, and properties they owned, ways that they were hiding money out of the country, ways that they were moving money out of the country, that sort of thing. And
Mm,
I collected it all in a lengthy memo, pages that I sent to my editor in San Jose, and I said, "Look, uh, this is really the story that we should be covering. Everybody else is completely wrapped up the investigation into the murder and so forth. we meaning this medium-sized newspaper in California are in a position where we don't have to worry about the breaking news. We can leave that to the New York Timeses and the Washington Post and the APs and so forth, and we can spend our time doing this story that underlies perhaps most of the Philippines' problems.
So
And
somehow,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so that laid the foundation for your book in '87, Worth
Exactly.
Dying For. And
Exactly.
of course, the title, it's not hard to guess, that was inspired by that speech or statement coming from Ninoy Aquino. But before I ask in detail about the book, the
Yeah.
process involved there, for today's generation, because you also have to understand in the Philippines there's so much disinformation. Those who are spreading lies and disinformation in favor of the Marcoses are exploiting the idea that today's generation are too young to remember the events that happened in '83, in '86. That's why it's very good that we have you tonight. So the assassination itself, how big really was that in terms, in the eyes of the world? The assassination of Ninoy Aquino in '83, and somehow did it surprise you that the fall of Marcos happened 3 years later, not sooner?
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Uh, the news. You asked me about how the
How,
news.
how big was it?
Yeah.
For example, for reference, the 9/11 attacks, that was such a big story in 2001. But in
Yeah.
this case, in the context of the world at that time, how big was it?
No, it did not. Certainly in America, you could not compare the two. I
Yeah.
mean, just the arithmetic alone is so completely different. The numbers, but nevertheless, um, the Philippines and the United States, as everybody knows, have a long and unique relationship. I mean, the Philippines was the only real colony that the United States ever had, and Filipinos came to came to America as immigrants. They served in the Navy and so forth. So and there are large communities of Filipino expats across America, most particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that's where the Mercury News had its largest readership. So I think if I had been working for a newspaper, say in the heartland of Chicago, perhaps, or Texas, I don't know, it might not have had that same impact. But my editors, saw that this was essential and crucial. So it was a huge story on the West Coast, and
Mm.
my investigative work was splashed across the front page of the paper regularly, and um, so okay, now where were we?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
The second question, basically, the fact that it happened 3 years later, the fall of Marcos after the assassination, somehow,
yeah.
people were thinking, should it have come sooner?
Okay, should it have? Yes. Let's leap forward a couple of decades and switch countries. Here we are in the United States now, facing, uh, in some ways, a similar situation in which a former president has been accused of all kinds of corrupt activities,
Mm.
and investigations are going on. Newspapers and television and all the other new media are reporting on this continuously around the clock, and yet it's moving very, very, very slowly. And 3 years after Trump leaves office, will this still be going on? It may very well. It may very well. So you had a situation in the Philippines at that time where you had a very strong president, strong in the sense of his powers, his legalistic powers. Of course, physically he was deteriorating, and those around him were worried about that. That's probably what really underlay the assassination of Aquino. The fear that that Marcos would die in office, and then what? But he still had the ability through his proxies to hold things back, and
Mm.
you will. None of this is really news to people like you, but maybe to the younger generation of Filipinos that you ask about. Uh, you would see in the reporting, and you will find in my book, Worth Dying For, that that Marcos would call various judges and lawyers and investigators and powerful and wealthy people to his office and to his living quarters in Malacanang, and tell them, lay off, step back, take it easy. I know how to. I have a quote. I remember it vividly. I know how to reciprocate, and that's very effective. So was I surprised that it was held off for 3 years? No, just disappointed.
Okay. You might also be surprised, but today, his loyalists, his supporters, are even disputing the fact that he was a dictator. For the record, coming from someone who actually covered the Philippines extensively, especially during that period in our history, was he a dictator?
Yes,
Pardon me for asking the obvious.
yes, yes, and yes. Of course,
Okay.
of course.
Okay. Yes, yes, and yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is a proper segue to my next question regarding your groundbreaking newspaper series, which won the Pulitzer Award.
Mm,
For those who are not familiar with the Pulitzer, that's the I think it's the most important journalism award. Okay, for any journalists. So you said that the foundation was laid. So basically, you prepared as early as 1983 when you started hearing about the hidden wealth, right? But
right,
but but how difficult was it to actually gather information, evidence, and talk to us about the breakthrough also and the impact of that report?
right. So it turned out that what I was gathering in Manila, when I would go to these morning coffee clutches and breakfasts with various politicians and business people, what I was gathering was what you know as chismes. It was gossip. And um, I could not prove any of it. I did whatever I could to try to get to records in the Philippines, government records, bank records, so forth. No success. So it became obvious to me and to my editors that the only way we were going to move ahead was to look for evidence in the United States, which was a good thing in the sense that many of the properties that we believed Imelda and Ferdinand owned were in places like New York, San Francisco, and
Mm.
so forth. So uh, one of my colleagues in San Jose, Pete Carey, one of honestly one of the world's better investigators, was assigned to follow up on the hints, the chismis, if you will, that I had. Am I pronouncing that right? Chismis, chismis,
Yeah,
chismis.
rumors,
Yeah, and he did. Pete,
chatter.
yeah, Pete was one of the early comers to computerized investigating by journalists. Prior to him, uh, people did what I had always done, and that is use our shoe leather, knock on doors, go
Mm.
back into libraries, morgues, as they call them in newspapers. But Pete was even then in the early '80s a computer whiz, and he found a real estate program that was not meant for what he wanted it how to use it, but it was meant for real estate investors and developers. And he used that to track down the properties and the papers behind the properties that we were discussing, that we
Mm.
believed we knew about. And he finally, when he had all of his ducks in a row on his screen, he left for New York and there confronted the lawyers for the Marcoses. There were a pair of brothers in New York City who had been investing for the Marcoses for decades, the Bernstein brothers,
Mm. Yeah.
and so forth. And then finally, this investigation, by the way, took a year, something that most newspapers back then would be loath to do. It cost an awful lot of money. It took us, Pete and I, out of circulation. And then toward the end, the editors added a young lady by the name of Catherine Ellison, who was a local San Francisco-based reporter, and she became the door knocker. to follow up. And I remember in particular her knocking on the door of the then mayor. Oh God, what was his name? It's slipping my mind. Mayor of Manila. Oh, sorry.
Okay. It's
And
old school knocking on the doors to get information and interviews.
you say, here, this is what we've got. Here,
Right.
here's the bank records. Here's the real estate records and the tax records and so on. And do you admit it or deny it? Anyway,
Mm.
so finally we nailed down the whole package, and it ran for 3 days. It was full double truck pages on the inside, uh, and streaming headlines on the front pages, and it had a huge impact uh, at much more in the Philippines than in the United States, not surprisingly, because the newspapers and news media in the Philippines back then were incapable and unable to report stories like this.
Mm.
So a number of editors of censored newspapers went ahead and did things like they would run whole sections of a story and then say, but of course we know this is not true. And so the point was made, and then the opposition parties began reprinting the whole series in pamphlets and dropping them from helicopters and small planes all over the archipelago, and
Mm.
in a variety of languages. So the word got out, and the story did have a great impact.
Mm. So the Crony members of the Crony press here in the Philippines were doing some sort of damage control
They
to
they were.
counter the impact of your reporting.
Yes, that is true. That is
By the way, were you able to quantify during your investigation into this? You and your team were you able to quantify the Marcos loot or hidden wealth at that time?
yes.
How much was it?
Yeah,
The estimate.
it was several $billion. I honestly, I've seen everything. I think up to $10 billion. Uh,
Mm.
I don't really know. I do recall. I don't remember. But I do recall that the underlying method behind these illicit investments was dollar salting, as it was called then, and it was estimated by Filipino economists that some 30 billion with a B dollars were taken out of the Philippine treasury and salted
Mm.
abroad by the crony crowd. And at the same time, it was estimated by these economists that the Philippine debt was $30 billion.
Yeah.
Coincidence? Maybe, but it tells you something.
Mm. And of course, the impact was there. So this won a Pulitzer Prize in '87. But how long did the series run?
3 days, and then there were follow-up stories. The investigation, the government's investigation into the assassination picked up steam, and and then of course the people power uh,
Happened. Yeah.
demonstrations in the streets, and that became.
Mm.
And I've got to say, when you asked earlier on, how big was this story of Ninoy's assassination? How did it compare with 9/11? It that that it did not, as I said. But when when Cory Aquino, when the elections were held, the fraudulent counting was exposed, and Cory Aquino was declared the winner. That was a huge story
Yeah.
all around the world. It was a fairy tale. For your younger viewers, that it was really uh, the the good guys have won. The princess has defeated the frog. And the U.S. Congress invited Mrs. Aquino to
Yeah.
speak before a joint session. She received standing ovations. It was a feel good story that everybody wanted to happen. Everybody would want that kind of a story to happen in their country. And it so rarely does. But there it happened in the Philippines. The aftermath is
Yeah.
another story.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about the aftermath, but my
Yeah.
apologies for not being a bit clearer earlier. I wasn't really asking about the impact of the Nina assassination in connection directly with the, let's say, 9/11. I just wanted to situate the assassination in itself in its particular context. Now,
Understand.
speaking of what happened after EDSA, indeed that was a fairy tale. The Philippines was a toast of the world, and it inspired other popular bloodless revolts elsewhere in the world. That's how important, that's how big an impact it had at that time, mind you, younger generation. But now, how do you feel with the fact that 36 years after Filipinos ousted the dictator and his family, his son is now president?
It's shocking. It's shocking. Uh, uh, I I can't say that um, it's completely without that it's completely not understandable, but it is understandable given the power uh, and the wealth of the Marcos family and their long experience in bringing in experts from other countries who know how to play issues and how to confuse people and influence them. The father did it, and so of course the son did it. The mother carries messages from the past to her son, if you will, and it's to me disappointing personally. I think we have going on right now in my country, in the United States, again, another similar situation. If you ask me, is it conceivable that a decade from now, 20 years from now, uh, Donald Trump Jr. could be elected president of the United States? Yes. Yes, we are going through, and this is not just the Philippines and or the United States. It's the whole world is going through a period of social upheaval that is possibly unprecedented. I think it is largely due to the communications revolution. Uh,
Mm-mm.
in my day, the Associated Press used to boast that it had a deadline a minute. Now, a minute is a very long time.
Yeah.
And every second is a deadline, and it goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So everybody now is a reporter. Everybody now is a photographer, and
Mm-mm.
and so we're swamped with information, and we get to choose what kind of information we want. There's the experts. I'm an expert. You're an expert. Everybody's an expert, and we get to express ourselves, and make it look like professional in print or on a screen or on the air. So we're going through this revolution, I would call it, and almost any result is conceivable as far as I can
Mhm.
see.
Yeah, that's true. Many different factors are involved or at play, no? But in this case, I've been hearing this sentiment that the fact that Filipinos, 36 years after we ousted the dictator and his family, and 50 years or close to 50 years after he declared martial law all over the Philippines, the son of the dictator is the president. Others are saying that somehow that is a sad reflection on our values as a nation, as a society, as Filipinos. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I do think it's fair. To tell you the truth, when this happened, when your election was concluded, and Ferdinand Jr. was declared the winner, um, I I wrote a bit saying that I thought this was a negative and poor reflection on Filipinos. And a number of Filipinos, it seemed pretty clear that they were younger people, 20 somethings, maybe 30 somethings, who responded and attacked me and said I didn't understand, that they had done everything in their power to see that it didn't turn out this way, and they were outfoxed by Marcos money, Marcos influence, and imported influencers.
Mm.
So the I think, unfortunately, nothing matters more than the result, and the result is this young fellow, youngish fellow now, has been elected. And yes, there are people in Filipinos, many of them perhaps, who are unhappy and wish it were otherwise. The same thing is true in the United States.
Yeah.
There are many Americans, roughly half the population, who were very unhappy to have Donald Trump elected, and are frothing at the mouth right now to have him tried and sent to jail. But the result and the result is, so far, he was elected president of the United States, and that's the way it is. That nothing
Yeah.
counts more than the result.
Okay. By the way, in the case of the new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., have you met him? And what do you think of him? What were your impressions?
No, 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 no. I I I never met him. Uh, I was in a couple of rooms with him when he was there with his family. He was a boy when yeah, I'm an old guy. I've been around a long time. So when I was in the Philippines 30, 40 years ago, he didn't have much influence. And I never had the opportunity to speak to him. I couldn't really discuss him.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our discussion, but at this point, let's talk about the lessons of EDSA, and perhaps as someone who saw it, uh, the
Mhm.
evolution for better or for worse in that portion of our history. I mean,
Yeah.
where do you think the errors happened after that fairy tale that you mentioned?
Uh-huh.
86, everyone was euphoric. Everyone was looking at a fresh start, and then it didn't exactly go uphill from there.
Yeah. Um, I guess I guess the answer is that fairy tales are not real, and you in the Philippines experienced something that very, very few people ever do. You set an example for much of the world, Middle East, Eastern Europe. People
Yeah.
power revolutions, color revolutions were taking place all across the world, and for that you deserve credit. And I personally feel just great respect and warmth for you as a people for accomplishing that. It's just not the kind of thing that can last. It can't last. So you're now faced with a situation with a president who is at least as unpopular as he is popular. I would assume that the population's attitudes towards him are pretty much split down the middle the way they are in the United States. And if enough young people, the people with energy, the people with commitment, the people who want change, can get themselves together and organize and vote and report themselves or through professional journalists what's going on, and keep the story alive, you have a chance. Uh, if not, if the younger generation allows events to get out of hand and to move ahead without them, if, for example, Ferdinand is found to never have been a dictatorship, never have committed the murders and the disappearances that the world knows he did. If he gets away with that in history, you'll have lost.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Lewis Simons, for joining us tonight. And
Thank
again, I think people were asking where they could buy your old book, To Die For, Worth Dying For, sorry. Worth
Yeah.
Dying For. Is that available online?
Well, there are a few. It's out of print, but the good news is, if anybody is interested, in about 6 months it will be re-released. This time in paperback, and it'll be available through Amazon and I suppose other outlets.
Okay. And
As will my new book.
yeah, your new book is To Tell the Truth, My
Yeah,
Life as a Foreign Correspondent, which will be available starting November 15,
right,
right?
right.
I'd like to invite you before that because I want to talk about. I want to see your perspective as a veteran journalist on how journalism has changed a lot, perhaps for better, for worse, over the past several years. Well, thank you
Wonderful.
very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Lewis Simons, and
Thank you.
see you again
Good. I look.
in the second part of our interview. Thank you, sir.
Take care. Bye bye.
Okay, that was Mr. Lewis Simons. Baka nakikita niyo po yung libro niya, no? Luma na pero I think yung mga naghahunt ng mga libro sa sa book sale, meron pang kopya diyan eh. I check kanina sa Amazon, meron pang ilang kopya kung gusto niyo umorder. Okay, bago tayo magpatuloy, no, meron akong gusto i-discuss sa inyo. Basahin ko lang ilan sa mga messages dito. Ayan. Sabi ni Noel Francia, kindly greet happy birthday. His wife, Francia Nunez, happy birthday. From New Jersey sa US. Ayan, binabati ka ng asawa mo. Happy birthday po sa inyo. Tapos, eto si John Roy Beleno. Hindi raw po siya troll. Wala mo na kung sinabing troll ka. I'm an FB poet in Ilocano. Following you as one of the public intellectuals to beat. Lakas naman, grabe. Ayan. Tapos, ito is Mr. Lewis Simon shocked at how quickly our nation forgets history. Yan ang pag-uusapan natin ngayon dito sa second part natin. Meron tayong truth bombs, no? Especially, malapit na po yung 50th anniversary ng declaration ng martial law. Okay? Mag-ano muna tayo? OBB. Okay, para po sa ating truth bombs ngayong gabing ito, no? So, ngayong linggo po, gugunitain natin yung 50 taon mula nung ipasailalim ni Ferdinand Marcos Sr. ang buong Pilipinas sa ilalim po ng martial law. Okay? Ako consider po ito na isa sa darkest periods in our history. Ang medyo hindi po lang po natin masyadong matanggap ngayon. Kumbaga pati yung portion ng history natin na yun, pilit na binubura o dinidistort ng mga nagpapakalat po ng kung ano-anong mga maling detalye ngayong kasalukuyang henerasyon. Yun po yung nakakatakot, no? Ini-airbrush, binubura po yung kasaysayan. Kasi kung ganun po ano mangyari po sa atin bilang bansa. So dapat po siguro mas pag-igihin natin yung pagtuturo at pagpapaalala sa ating mga kababayan doon po sa mga nangyari nung nakaraan. Okay? Marami po kasi nga na nakakagulat, no? Dahil sinasabi nila mismo, pati mga basic facts that have been established long ago. Facts po, no? Ito po yung objective facts. Pwede nyo po i-check. Makikita nyo po sa records. For example, diktador ba si Ferdinand Marcos Sr? Opo. Kanina, tinanong natin sa ating panayam. Ang sagot ng ating panahuin, isang veteran journalist na nag-cover po ng Marcos regime ng matagal na panahon. Yes, yes, and yes. Yan po dapat hindi na po dinidispute, no? Sinasabi nila, nakabuti naman daw yung batas militar, siguro sa ilang tao, pero dun sa karamihan o sa mas nakararaming Pilipino, hindi po. Okay? Ito po yung mga susuriin natin. Kasi for example, 1986, lahat tayo masasaya, di ba? So, sabi nga ng ating panahuin, fairy tale. Minsan kasi nagkakaroon tayo ng problema after ng isang pivotal moment in our history. Parang hindi natin napupulot yung lessons o yung mga aral mula doon sa pangyayaring yun sa kasaysayan for us to move forward. Kaya minsan, iniisip ko, ito po yung gusto kong tutukan sa ating, sa ating truth bombs ngayong gabi. Ano lang ba tayo, forgetful? Makakalimutin? Number 2, forgiving. Number 3, apathetic, walang pakialam. O yung worst, yung pang-apat po, pathetic. Kasi sa totoo lang, ordinarily, mag-iisip tayo dapat, di ba? Bakit sa kabila ng record when it comes to human rights, sa hidden wealth, sa ill-gotten wealth ng isang pamilya, yung mga botanteng Pilipino, 36 years after ousting that family from power, the president then, in 86 EDSA, i-elect yung presidente, i-elect na presidente yung anak ng dating diktador. Doon pa lang, ordinarily, mapapakamot na tayo, no? Pero yun na po yung resulta, no? Marami pong dahilan that would point to the victory in May 2022 of President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Again, to be fair, hindi po natin siya tinatawag na diktador dahil hindi naman siya talaga diktador, no? Ngayon, kung magiging diktador siya, that's another story. Pero I don't think so. I don't think that would happen. Ang gusto ko pong puntuhin dito, saan ba tayo nagkamali? Bakit parang ang bilis makalimot ng mga Pilipino? Yung forgiving natin, pagiging forgiving natin, I think that's a given. Pero bakit ang bilis natin makalimot? Siguro dahil yung EDSA mismo, nagkaroon tayo ng mga failings after that. Institutionally, we failed to strengthen certain institutions that should have been strengthened afterward. Political parties, for example, hindi natin pinalakas. Of course, you could also understand the failings of the first Aquino administration, yung kay Cory Aquino. Dahil yung time na yon, hindi niya hawak yung militar eh. Makikita niyo, pag pinag-aralan niyo po yung kasaysayan, nandun po yung constant threat or insecurity. At katunayan, di ba, sangkatutak po yung mga kudeta na nangyari sa ilalim ng kanyang pamamahala. So nandoon yung nandun yung insecurity in terms of leadership, nandoon yung samot-saring problema in terms of putting the house in order after 21 years of Marcos regime. Tapos tinatanong ng iba, kung talaga nagkasala, bakit hindi nakakulong? Ilang beses po natin sinasagot yan. Tapos sinasabi, wala naman doon napatunayan na ill-gotten wealth. Yun pa lang po, yung mga bagay na yun, dapat binabalikan natin yung mga napatunayan sa kasaysayan tsaka sa official records po ng ating pamahalaan. No? So yung ill-gotten wealth, tulad ng binanggit ko po dati, yan po yung mismong terminolohiya na ginamit po noong 2003 Supreme Court decision. Pero bakit ngayon patuloy pa rin po nating dinideny, no? So, nga po, ano ba yung problema sa atin? Forgetful ba? Forgiving? Apathetic? O pathetic lang? Yan po yung pag-iisipan nating mabuti. Kasi hindi tayo uusad bilang isang bansa kung hindi natin ina-acknowledge yung mga kamalian ng kasaysayan. At kung gagawin natin, magpapabiktima lang tayo doon sa mga taong gustong burahin yung kasaysayan. Again, we're not disputing the victory of President Marcos Jr. 31 million Filipinos voted him as president officially. So, napakalaking mandato po nun. Pero sana, sa paggunita natin ng 50 years ng martial law declaration, sana wag nating burahin sa kasaysayan yung mga nangyari. Tulad nga po yung sinabi ni dating PCGG chairman, dating Senate President Jovito Salonga. Sabi niya, national reconciliation without truth and justice would be a mockery. Kasi ngayon, masarap pakinggan. Hindi, magkaisa na lang tayo, kalimutan na, past is past. Nadidinig natin yan madalas, no? Pero kung may mga taong hanggang ngayon hindi tinatanggap at pilit na pinapabango yung mga mabantot na bahagi ng ating kasaysayan, anong klaseng unity po o pagkakaisa yung matatamo natin, no? Kaya paulit-ulit lang po 'yan. So makikita niyo nagiging cyclical yung nagiging problema natin sa ating kasaysayan. Yung sa mga nagtatanong po doon sa estimate, kanina kasi tinanong ko yung ating panahuin, magkano ba yung estimate ng Marcos loot based sa kanilang investigation sa kanilang Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper series. Sabi niya mga nasa 10 billion. Yung 10 billion na dollar estimate na yun po ay nandito sa aklat na ito. Ayan. Presidential plunder ni Mr. Jovito Salonga. Ang sabi niya, yung estimate na yon, nakuha niya base doon sa mga nabasa niya intelligence report coming from the United States. So doon daw nabuo yung estimate na yon. Pero base sa ating mga panayam, doon sa ibang mga nakakaalam din katulad ni dating PCGG Commissioner Ruben Carranza, mahirap din talaga daw estimate, no? Pwedeng mas marami pa, pwedeng mas konti pa. Kasi nga po, hindi po ganun kadali na habulin yung mga nakaw na yaman o hidden wealth ng mga Marcoses. I suggest marami po mga libro tukol dun sa bahaging iyon ng ating kasaysayan. Isa po sa mga recommend kong basahin nyo ito po. Presidential Plunder ni Jovito Salonga. Nakadetalye po niya kung gaano po kahirap yung paghahabol at paghahanap ng hidden wealth ng mga Marcoses during the early years or months of the Aquino administration. Cory Aquino administration. Noong time na yun, revolutionary government pa lang, di ba? Dahil hindi pa binubuo yung 1987 Constitution. Pero yung time na yun, binuo na agad po yung Presidential Commission on Good Government. At originally kasi, ang binigay naman, ang inutos sa kanya ni Cory Aquino, kay Jovito Salonga, hanapin yung mga human rights violators, panagutin, at the same time, habulin yung Marcos ill-gotten wealth. Pero sabi niya, masyado po yata mahirap yun, no? So magtayo na lang, kaya sinuggest niya na magtayo na lang ng Commission on Human Rights. Kaya yun po, inaitayo eventually. At nag-concentrate sila doon sa pagkalap, doon sa paghahanap ng ill-gotten wealth sa PCGG. And of course, ngayon, 36 years later, pinag-uusapan natin ngayon, diba? Dahil may ilang mga kongresista or may isang kongresista po, si Congressman Benny Abante, ang proposal niya, i-abolish na raw yung PCGG. Well, hindi po natin alam kung matutuloy iyon kasi pwede namang hindi siya i-abolish, pwedeng pahinain na lang, di ba? Hindi bigyan ng sapat na pondo. Kasi pag nabasa niyo pong history ng PCGG, talagang ever since napakahirap. Kakaunting tao, kakaunting resources, and given the enormous resources of the Marcos family and their cronies, it was not definitely easy to recover the hidden wealth or the ill-gotten wealth. Kasi nakatago po sa iba't ibang mga bansa Paano mo hahabulin kung yung resources mo limited? Ilan po sanang intindihin natin, no? Hindi ko po dinidiscuss ito dahil tulad ng sinasabi ng mga trolls, no? Ano kayo, puro kayo dilawan, anti-Marcos kayo. Subukan niyo pong buksan yung pag-iisip niyo, no? Hindi na po ako mag-a-appeal doon sa mga trolls sa talagang nabayaran para mag-comment na kung ano-anong wala sa hulog, no? Pero yung po iba na yung siguro talagang fan na fan kayo ng mga Marcoses, and I don't fault you for that, no? Pero try to acknowledge yung mga facts sa ating kasaysayan. And hindi natin we're not judging you, we're not judging you for voting for the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Ano na yun panibagong yugto na po ito, no? At titingnan natin kung paano yung magiging pamamahala niya. For all you know, baka naman he would prove his critics wrong, no? Na talagang baka naman gumanda yung takbo ng Pilipinas under him. Let's see, no? Baka naman mabawasan talaga yung palakasan, yung rent seeking, yung bata-bata system sa pamahalaan, yung pag-abuso ng ilang mga malalaking negosyante sa government contracts. Baka naman yun talaga matutukan niya, di ba? Let's see. Masyado pa maaga, no? Wala pang first 100 days. Pero nga po, wag naman tayo magbulag-bulagan doon sa kasaysayan. Kasi ang hirap pag binubura natin based on our convenience. Because that would reflect badly on us as a people, no? So, tulad nung sinabi ko kanina, ano ba tayo? Forgetful? Forgiving? Apathetic? Or simply pathetic? Yan po yung pag-isipan natin at maraming salamat po for joining us tonight.